Hello, I'm going to be a bit squinty in this video because the sun is so bright, but I don't really want to wear sunglasses if I don't absolutely have to, because there's sort of less of a connection, I think, when you wear sunglasses. So, and we've already got the screen in the way, so I don't want to add to it. So anyway, in this video I want to talk about whether it's a good idea to label people who have personality disorders. And what got me thinking about it in the first place was when I was talking about Chris Watts. For people who follow this channel, I think most of you will know who Chris Watts is because I made quite a few videos about him. He murdered his pregnant wife and his two small children last year, and he's now in prison for it. This happened in Colorado, and I'm not going to go into more detail about it. There's loads of videos about it if you want to have a look at those. But I talked about him as being a narcissist, and I talked about why and why I felt he fit the criteria. And I also made a video about him and a couple of other murderers, and talked about whether they might also be psychopaths, what the criteria are for that. And although it's not in the DSM-5 criteria, so it's not really official anymore, that term, as a category. But anyway, I looked at that, at Hare's list, and antisocial personality disorder. But aside from all of that, I was saying yes, he is a narcissist in my opinion, and there was a lot of disagreement about that. I can't even my eyes are now watering from the sun. So there was a lot of disagreement about that from other YouTubers. People were getting really angry about him being called a narcissist. I mean, there was one guy who was even making videos about my videos in particular, you know, and how wrong I was. And I think he had, I didn't actually see his videos, but I did ask someone to send me the general arguments that were out there for why he wasn't a narcissist. And then I made a video called Debunking the Myths about Chris Watts. And I saw a video around this time by a psychologist who was saying that, you know, she doesn't see why it matters if he is a narcissist or not. Why does it matter if either way? You know, why do we have to worry about that term? And if we apply it to him, and in it, I could see her point in that it was getting ridiculous, this argument about a word, you know, and about narcissistic traits, about another word. What's the label for? Why do we need it? And there are other arguments for why labeling people can be a real problem. For example, partly because people change. We're not set in stone, you know. So, for instance, if you're diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, 50% of you, or 50% of people who have that diagnosis, don't meet the criteria in 5 years. So, but they're labelled as having borderline personality disorder, and in Britain at least, that label goes to the doctor as well. So your GP sees you as having borderline personality disorder, and a lot of people have a bias towards people with that diagnosis. Even within the mental health field, they might treat you as if you're manipulative, you know, and treat you suspiciously. I read an article in The Independent by a psychologist who was saying that as soon as that diagnosis is dropped, people get treated really differently by mental health professionals. So there's a lot of reasons why being labelled with a personality disorder might be a problem. It can even affect you getting some jobs. Some employers want to see a medical report about you. So that label can really get in your way. A personality disorder is usually in response to childhood trauma. It's someone's coping mechanism. So why should people be punished by being labelled and put in a box for just trying to survive after this kind of trauma? What good does it do? You know, and people are different, you know, we're all unique. Why do we all have to fit, you know, and be a certain way? Otherwise we get labelled and called something that has all these negative connotations, especially because some of the reasons that people get labelled are based on quite, you know, fairly old-fashioned ways of thinking, when people used to connect more with their society. And so things like, how many friends do you have? Are you employed? You know, those kinds of questions would have been more relevant back then, and they might not really say that much about someone now. People have talked about being labelled with a personality disorder as being traumatic because they identify with that label, and it tells them something about their worth. They feel like they're now less than everyone else because they've been separated, you know, and put into this pigeonhole. So for the person who's getting the diagnosis, it's not necessarily helpful. In some cases it might mean that they get, especially you know, on the NHS in the UK, it might mean that you get a particular specialist therapy that you wouldn't get without that diagnosis. So in that sense it can be useful, but you can see that there are a lot of reasons why it might not be. And there's also the argument that the more we talk about personality disorders, the more people get labelled by others who've never even met them. That happens a lot, that people pick up on a couple of things that they've heard in gossip articles, and then they decide that this person is a narcissist, or that they have borderline personality disorder, or histrionic personality disorder, or some other disorder, or bipolar is one that gets blasted around a lot as well, if somebody seems a bit hyper. And yet, despite all of these arguments that I think are really good arguments for why we shouldn't label people, I babble on about narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic traits on this channel, and I'm going to be talking more about other personality disorders as well. So why do I do that? I've talked a bit about that in another video that ended up being much too long and started talking about something else as well. So I'm going to put that video here and give you my reasons for why I think it's actually really important to discuss these different traits. It's very humid here, so you'll have to excuse my hair. People who experience abusive relationships very often don't just experience one. You might find yourself walking straight into another one, even if this person seems to be different at first. Or you might find that in your life in general, there are lots of different people who seem to be aiming their abuse at you. And very often, the reason that someone will keep walking into these situations is because they're attracted to abusive types of people, and the reason that they're attracted to them is because there's something familiar about them, and very often they've experienced some form of abuse in childhood. And this abuse might not be the kind of abuse people often talk about when they think of childhood abuse. You know, it might not be physical abuse or sexual abuse. It might just be a very subtle form of manipulation that they've experienced, you know, throughout their childhood, that's taught them that they're not allowed to have boundaries, or they're not allowed to have certain boundaries, that their needs come second, you know, and they grow up learning that there's something about them that makes them deserving of abuse. And so because they believe that, they accept abuse. And sometimes even when they know that that the relationship is wrong, they have to get out, you know, and they leave an abusive relationship, they're still drawn to this type of person because deep down they feel that they deserve the abuse and that the abuse is about them. And the reason that other people don't stick around, the reason that some people don't tend to get abused, at least, rarely, that they notice red flags and they get themselves away from that kind of person, is because they can quickly distinguish between themselves and the abuser. So in other words, when the abuse happens, they can see that it's a reflection of the abuser and not of their own value as a person. Because, in their childhoods, they didn't have this confusing experience of what's really brainwashing. Because when your brain is still developing, if you're taught something over and over again, you believe it. So these people who bring themselves to safety and don't allow abusive people to abuse them do that because they have a clear head and they can see what is about them and what is about the other person. And for those people who haven't had that luck, whose childhood was very different from that, they can't suddenly overnight become the other people. They can't suddenly develop self-esteem and self-love, and distinguish between what is about them and their value as a person and what's about another person. You can't suddenly do that out of nowhere. So on this channel, the reason I talk a lot about narcissists, narcissistic traits, and I'll be talking about different cluster B disorders more, but the reason that I do that and the reason I use this language is because it's another way to get to the same goal. When you learn about different disorders, you can see that the traits and the behaviours are about that disorder and they're not about you. So once you start to see a pattern of behaviour in different narcissists, for instance, on this channel, when someone behaves like that towards you and you see this pattern in them, you can see that this is about them and it's what they do with different people. You happen to be their target now. And so that's a really powerful way to get to that point of being able to separate yourself and your own value as a person from someone's abusive behaviour. And then when you get to that point of being able to do that, then you can start to have boundaries and stick to those boundaries and take them seriously, because you can believe that you deserve to have boundaries and you don't deserve this kind of behaviour. And then from there, your self-esteem can start to improve. And you can end up actually getting to the same place as those other people who didn't need to ever learn about narcissists because they automatically understood that they don't deserve abuse. So a lot of therapists and psychologists don't understand the value of learning about personality disorders in healing yourself from abuse. They think, I spoke to a psychologist quite recently who was saying that her client had been talking about her ex and how he's a narcissist, and she was thinking, well, how do you know? You can't just diagnose people like that. And I can see her point in professional terms. I'm really careful on these videos about diagnosing people. There was some disagreement under my video about Meghan Markle because I didn't want to say that she's a narcissist based on hearsay, based on behaviour that's you can read about in the tabloids that might just be gossip. We don't actually know how much of it's true, or we don't know the context of it. We don't know what somebody did beforehand, before she reacted in a certain way. So I'm really careful about that in this context, and I'll talk about traits and try to bring evidence up, if I ever do say that I think someone's a narcissist. But in your own personal lives, it's different. And I think actually there's a lot of value in learning about patterns and seeing traits in people and thinking that these traits fit with what might be a personality disorder. So even if you get it wrong, if somebody doesn't have enough traits, if they don't fulfill the criteria in the DSM-5, you know, for being for having narcissistic personality disorder, it doesn't really matter, because you're not figuring this out in a professional capacity. If you see 3 traits, or if you see 3 abusive behaviours that keep showing themselves when you're around this person, you know, and you're experiencing abuse, and you recognise that from videos like these ones or other channels about cluster B personality disorders, then that information can help you to keep yourself safe. That tells you something, and it's good to trust that. You don't need these people to be diagnosed as having a personality disorder. Someone who has narcissistic personality disorder very often wouldn't be diagnosed anyway, mostly because they'd never seek help, and also because they'd be capable of manipulating the therapist or lying, you know, because they have contempt for the whole therapy situation. So the diagnosis is not the important thing. The important thing is to notice the different patterns of behaviour and to understand that they are about somebody's character. And it doesn't matter if you only notice 3 parts of that pattern, or 5 parts, or 1 part. All that matters is that you are aware of abusive behaviour, and you know that you understand that behaviour is a reflection of somebody's character and not your worth as a person, and that under no circumstances do you deserve to be abused. I spoke to another psychologist recently who said to me, isn't that just about defining everyone as victims? You know, and so that's another way to look at it. If you're just looking at somebody as having a personality disorder, then doesn't that just encourage people to think of themselves as victims? And yes, it does do that. But that in my opinion is also okay, because as a victim you also play a role, and I'll talk about that in other videos, but somebody doesn't abuse someone unless they can, you know, unless they can get away with it. So in that sense, the abuse is partly about the person who's being abused, that they are letting that happen, and that there is a need in them that causes them to stay in that situation. And that is a really important topic to discuss, and it's just as important, I think, as it is to understand the abuser, is to understand yourself and why you get yourself into these situations and why you stick around, you know. But until you can see that the behaviour isn't deserved and it isn't a reflection of your value as a person, it can actually be really hard to look at yourself and to understand why you've got yourself into the situations that you have. So I'm going to leave it here. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.